After I posted my recent videos about the Roland TD516, I got quite a few comments from some of you asking why I switched from my previous EFNOTE 5 to the new Roland drum set, what the difference between these two kits was, and basically which one is the better one for you. Today we'll finally be getting to that long-awaited comparison video where I will compare pretty much everything I can think of to compare between these two drum sets based on my experience with them, from the sound to the feel, and comparing every single component of each drum set. And I really hope this will be useful for you guys. For some context, I was previously playing Roland drums all the way from 2010 when I got my very first electronic drum kit, all the way to 2024, which is when I switched to the EFNOTE 5, and I played that for about 2 years before changing to my current TD516 about 2 or 3 months ago. Before I start the more detailed comparison, let's first look at whether these two drum sets are even in the same price bracket for comparison. And I'm from Singapore, so I'm going to tell you the prices where I am. Where I live, the Roland kit is going at 5,003, and the EFNOTE 5 is going at 4,002 Singapore dollars. If we look on Sweetwater, the Roland is about 3.7K US and the EFNOTE 5 is 3.2K US. Now, this is not the total cost you'll need because both of those kits don't come with hardware, which means you need to add in your hi-hat stand, your snare stand, your bass drum pedal, and your drum throne. But if you've already got a drum set, it's possible you have some of these hardware pieces already. But also note that the EFNOTE is going to need 2 more cymbal stands because the Roland is mounted on a rack, so it doesn't need separate cymbal stands. You do need to budget for 2 extra cymbal stands for the EFNOTE 5. Something else to bear in mind is that the number of components that each kit has is a bit different. The Roland is a 5-piece kit, which means it's got your kick, snare, and 3 toms, whereas the EFNOTE is a 4-piece kit. It only has 2 toms, so that's kick, snare, and 1 rack, 1 floor. So we're short of 1 tom in comparison. And the Roland comes with 2 crashes, a ride, and hats, whereas the EFNOTE has 1 crash, ride, hats, and a splash. Sort of the same number of pads, but that splash is a single zone sensor, or rather a single zone trigger, so it's not as comparable to your standard crash pad, which is usually at least a 2-zone trigger, which means there's the edge as well as the bow or the top part of the cymbal. The other thing about the splash pad is it is really small and it just didn't feel right using that as a right crash. I did not add the expansion to my EFNOTE kit, and I basically just used the ride cymbal as my second crash. But if you do want to add on the expansion, there is an expansion set which adds on 1 extra rack tom as well as 1 extra crash. But that in Singapore is going at 1.4K Singapore dollars. Then if we wanted to add a so-called splash pad to the Roland to kind of match up to exactly what the EFNOTE has, you could top up $109 to add on a CY8, and that would bring us to a total of 5.6K Sing for the EFNOTE, which is a 5-piece kit with 2 crashes, and a bit over 5.4K for the Roland with the same setup, including an extra cymbal pad. Although the base EFNOTE kit is cheaper, if we kind of top up all the odds and ends to get them to the same lineup of components, it is more expensive than the Roland. So all that to say is I would consider these roughly in the same ballpark of price category when it comes to comparison. Putting prices aside, the main difference between the Roland kit and the EFNOTE kit is that the Roland is a rack-mounted pad-based kit. That means everything is on a rack and your drums don't have a full shell to them. They're just electronic pads. Whereas the EFNOTE kit is a real drum set. If you put actual drum heads on it, it would sound like a normal drum kit. In terms of size, both of them take up roughly the same width. Of course, you could set it up a little bit further apart or closer together. It's around 140 to 145 cm based on how I set these two drum sets up. That's around 55 to 57 inches. But the EFNOTE takes up more floor space because of the cymbal stands. And this is the main reason why I couldn't add in the expansion even if I wanted to, because I was just out of floor space in my studio. I would not be able to fit in one more cymbal stand for an extra crash. However, the use of real drums and real hardware for your cymbals means that you have more realistic positioning. When you have a pad-based kit, it's very easy to set it up poorly, and a lot of beginners who have electronic drum sets just don't know how to set up their drums, and they're just overlapping or too close together, and it's not realistic. It's not going to help you when you go to play an actual acoustic drum set. In terms of your cymbal positioning, the cymbal stands are going to give you so much more flexibility in positioning your cymbals versus having to mount them on the rack. It is a little bit limiting. So it is a trade-off between saving space, especially floor space, and having better control over the position of your cymbals and drums. Using actual cymbal stands also just gives you better real-world knowledge of how to adjust and set up actual drum hardware. I know a lot of students who have started out playing electronic drum sets. They might have played drums for years, they might be really good players, but when they go out to gig, they don't know what to do with the cymbal stand because they just never had the opportunity to adjust actual cymbal stand components before. So if you're a beginner, that could be a point in favor of getting a drum set that uses actual hardware because you're going to get more familiar with that and it's going to be more helpful when you do start playing outside. Finally, there is the additional benefit of a kit with full shells just looking a lot better, especially if you're going to be using this on a stage. There's just something about the actual shells of an acoustic drum shell pack that has better stage presence than a bunch of pads that look like electronic drums. And if you're going to be using these kits in a performance situation, that could very well be an important criteria for you. One point in favor of the rack-based kit is it's a lot easier to manage your cables. It's just so much easier to coil excess cables around a rack. In defense of the EFNOTE, I really did not try at all to put my cables neatly today, but even when I was using this kit, I kind of just stuffed everything under the bass drum because it was too troublesome to tidy them up and put them neatly anywhere. It is possible, but just takes a bit more effort. One more point that I'm going to mention here because I don't know where else to put it is that of durability. This was not really an issue for me because I'm not a heavy hitter, but I have friends who are heavy hitters and I've seen that the EFNOTE rims as well as the cymbals can fall apart. That is not to say that the Roland cymbals and pads are indestructible, but just from my personal experience when I go to shared venues, I've seen more EFNOTE kits and cymbals that are falling apart than Roland kits that are falling apart. So again, I can't really say this from my own personal experience, but from my observations, I feel like Roland kits are probably a bit more durable than the EFNOTEs, and that's something to bear in mind if you're a heavy hitter. Moving on to a more specific comparison of the sound of both of these kits as well as individual pads. Of course, you can edit the sounds to quite an extent for both of them, but I'm just going to compare based on a couple presets because I know that's what most people will be using out of the box. In terms of the number of presets on each of these modules, the EFNOTE 5 comes with 17 preset kits, and the V51 module comes with 70 preset kits. A bunch of these are from 2 preloaded expansion pack slots, and you can add on more expansion packs. Downloading new sounds from the Roland Cloud. You can also download other presets from the EFNOTE website and load them up into the EFNOTE 5 module, but these kits are only going to use pre-existing sounds that are already in the module. Whereas when you download expansion packs from the Roland Cloud, some of them are going to have brand new sounds in combination with existing sounds on the module. If you're like me, you might want to create or modify your own preset kits, so it's probably important to know how many options you have for each. In terms of the number of samples, the EFNOTE has 14 snares, 10 bass drums, 4 hi-hats, 11 crashes, 8 sets of toms, 1 china, 4 splashes, 5 ride cymbals, and 16 percussion or other sounds. The Roland V51 module has 11 snare drums, 6 hi-hats, 15 crashes, 7 ride cymbals, 4 sets of toms, and one of them includes a gong drum, 3 chinas, 4 splashes, 3 stacks, 22 bass drums, and way too many percussion and additional sounds that I didn't even bother counting. The numbers I gave you for the Roland instruments was not counting any of the preloaded expansion packs, which actually come with more snare and kick and assorted other sounds. The V51 module really does have a lot of options, especially considering that you can layer up to 3 sounds together and trigger that on a pad. You can also unlink the head and rim of the drum to put like different percussion sounds on, say, the rim of a drum while the head is still playing a tom sound. And that's something you can't do on the EFNOTE. So I never did use any of the percussion sounds on the EFNOTE because I didn't have a separate pad that I could use to trigger those special effect sounds. And that's something to take note when you're thinking about the versatility of the sounds here. But enough of me talking, let's get into the groove comparisons. I am just going to arbitrarily choose a couple preset drum kits that I think have similar concepts from the EFNOTE as well as the Roland modules and play mostly the same groove back to back and let you guys see what you think about the different sounds. I hope that was an interesting comparison for you. Do note that the DW 50th anniversary kits that I included at the end are paid content, and those need to be downloaded from the Roland Cloud, which means you need to have a subscription or buy the kits individually. For all of these recordings, I'm taking the master output of both modules and recording them directly into my computer. I'm not recording over USB, so everything is just mixed down. There's no post-processing. It is just the levels and EQ that is directly from the module defaults, and so that should be pretty similar to what you hear from these presets out of the box. Generally, my thoughts on the sounds of these two is that the EFNOTE sounds are a little bit more raw, while the Roland sounds are more processed. And this isn't an issue of whether one is better than the other, but they kind of have different purposes. The more raw sounds of the EFNOTE can be a little bit more organic when you're practicing, but the more processed sounds are going to sound a little bit better and sit nicer in a mix. More specifically, I prefer the cymbal sounds from the EFNOTE, but I prefer the shell sounds from the Roland. When I was playing the EFNOTE kit, I always felt like something was lacking from the snare and tom sounds in particular because they just didn't have the depth and punch that I was looking for. But now when I'm playing the Roland, it's the cymbal sounds that are a little bit not so great, especially the hi-hat. I really don't like the Roland hi-hat sound. I think it is too artificial and thin, whereas the EFNOTE hi-hat sound is a little bit more organic and actually sounds like a hi-hat. So, pros and cons. For this next section of the video, we'll look in greater detail at each component of the kit, and I'll let you know my thoughts about each of them. First up, let's start with the snare. The main difference between the EFNOTE snare and the Roland snare is that the EFNOTE snare is 12 inches and the Roland snare is 14 inches. And this was a game changer for me because the EFNOTE snare always just felt too small. Because it's an actual drum, it just felt like playing a 12-inch snare. And that just felt so weird when I was playing heavier music, like heavier rock and metal kind of stuff. So it was a breath of fresh air to get to play the bigger Roland 14-inch snare. And this digital snare is a lot more sensitive. If you listen closely to the buzz roll I did, the EFNOTE had some difficulty picking up the quietest of strokes, whereas the digital snare picks up most quiet strokes. Of course, there is a level of super quiet hits that won't be detected, but it's a lot easier to just play normally and get everything to trigger properly with the digital snare. I do feel like this snare drum is a little too big for this particular kit though, because the racks are 10-inch toms and the floor tom is 12 inches. So I think a 13-inch digital snare would have been the sweet spot, but I'm pretty sure that cost too much to make. And so they just give everyone a 14-inch, which is fine. When I first started playing the EFNOTE, the extra piece that triggers the cross stick was such a huge step up because the previous Roland kit I was playing needed you to toggle the cross stick on in the module, and the triggering was a bit fiddly sometimes. So the EFNOTE had a really good way of solving that, but of course the Roland snare takes it one step further by sensing your hand on the snare and then triggering the cross stick sound. That just means that you have more versatility in playing your cross stick anywhere on the snare drum besides just on that small cross stick trigger piece. The positional sensing on the snare is also a nice thing to have, which just gives you a bit more nuance in playing and it makes a bit more sense. One final note about the snare is that on the F-note snare, the tension rods come loose really quickly, and this is something I noticed very early on in playing. It, again, doesn't make that much of a difference for me because I'm not a super heavy hitter, but I do need to tighten it pretty often, and that's just something that could have been designed a little better. To me, the Roland toms are a clear winner. I really enjoyed playing these toms, and it's not just because I have one more of them. Whatever they did with the sample triggering makes it so much more enjoyable to play these. The toms sound punchy and full, and they're not as susceptible to the machine gunning effect, which is where it sounds like you have the exact same sample triggering over and over again. And that's something that I feel you can hear quite clearly on the F-note, especially with the roll on the floor tom. It sounds really fake and artificial. It didn't really bother me a lot while I was using the F-note because I don't particularly play super fast, but the sound that was produced by the kit also didn't lend itself to making me want to try and play fast on it because it would just sound bad. So yeah, for this one, I'm giving the win to Roland. In terms of sound, I feel like the kicks on both of these kits are comparable because you can easily adjust them to sound more like what you want. You can hear that there's more processing on the Roland kick, especially in this particular drum set. The F-note kick sounds a little bit more round and warm, whereas the Roland kick has a bit of maybe compression. There's a clear attack when it's played loud. But what mattered more to me as a player was the feel of the drum. And the F-note kick is an 18-inch actual bass drum, which means it feels like an 18-inch kick, whereas the Roland kick is just a pad, and it gives you a more generic feel. When I'm playing that 18-inch kick pad, I feel like I have to bounce the beater because it's got high tension, it's kind of springy, and it makes me feel like I should be playing something light and funky. Whereas on the Roland kick, it doesn't feel like a bass drum, which means it could be anything. And this felt a lot more natural when I wanted to, for example, practice double pedal. When I wanted to bury the beater or to play heavier styles of music, I preferred playing that on the Roland a lot. In fact, while I was using the F-note, I almost never practiced double pedal on that kit because it just felt so wrong. The other thing about the F-note is because it's an actual bass drum, there is a lot of acoustic sound coming from the kick. And maybe this contributes to why I felt that way about it, besides just the rebound feeling. There will be a lot of echoey, ringy sound because the front head is not a mesh head, so it does resonate. And at the moment, I have a pillow inside this bass drum to muffle the front head. That's something you might want to do when you get this bass drum. If not, you might be a little bit disturbed by the loudness of the kick relative to the rest of the heads. because the snare and toms are two-sided mesh heads, which means they have the batter as well as the reso head both being mesh, so they're a little bit more quiet than the bass drum. That said, the good side of having a real bass drum on the EFNOTE is that it is 100% stable, it is not moving anywhere at all. The Roland kick, I would say, is 95% stable. It does wobble a little bit, but it's also pretty heavy, so it's not really going anywhere. I will give EFNOTE props for designing really good kick pad protectors though, and they actually give you 3 replacements when you buy the kit. These are nicely designed for double pedals, and they are pretty thick. There's like foam. These things are nice. You'll be well stocked when you get a kit, even if you're a pretty heavy hitter and you need to replace these a couple times. The first difference you'll notice between Roland cymbals and EFNOTE cymbals is that Roland cymbals are an absolute magnet for stick marks. You play them for 5 minutes and it looks like you've been wailing on them for 5 months. Whereas the EFNOTE cymbals are practically immune to stick marks, and it did take me a couple months of playing for them to look like they were a little bit used. That said, you can easily clean off both of these with a dry cloth or a damp cloth if you want to really take off more stick marks. But again, they're just going to come back really quickly on the Roland. So anyway, let me show you an example of cleaning these things. I will note that the Roland digital hats and ride are made of a different material from the older crashes, and if anything, they are even more prone to stick marks and slightly harder to clean off. It is just cosmetic, but I do wish they had made it out of a material that was not so susceptible to stick marks. Electronic drum sets really just can't emulate acoustic cymbals, and there is nothing that can match up to the feeling of one. But when it comes to the crashes and crash swells, I would say the EFNOTE is a little bit more natural because it can produce quiet edge hits. For Roland cymbals, the way the triggers are set up is the edge trigger, which is the washy sound, that only is able to happen when you cross a certain threshold of velocity. And what that means is if you hit quietly, you are only going to be able to trigger the bow sound, which is the ding sound and not the psh. And that's not what we want when we're doing cymbal swells, because we want to start from a quiet wash and get to a louder wash. But the Roland is always going to start with a quiet bow sound. And I don't know why this is something that they still haven't fixed in 2026 or 2025 when this kit was out. I have tried to look into the settings and see if I could adjust anything to make the edge hits quiet, but short of assigning the edge sound to the bow, I don't think it is possible. If you do know how to do this, please let me know, because I couldn't find out any way to do that. The EFNOTE, on the other hand, it used to be that the edge could trigger quietly and you could do a swell that way. But over time, I think parts of the trigger sensors are just not working properly. So I had to rotate the crash to find a part of the cymbal that was able to do a swell properly without triggering the bow sound. And this is probably due to this particular kit being 2 years old. I don't recall that happening earlier on when I first got it. But I think that's also happened with the EFNOTE kit that is being used at my church. And sometimes when you hit it, the edge sound just doesn't come out. The good thing is it is a 360-degree sensor, so you can kind of just rotate the cymbal to find the part of it that is going to trigger correctly and use that. So this is a really weird comparison to make, but I'm still going to give the win to EFNOTE because it sometimes gets it right, and it's only after parts of the trigger start dying that you're going to get unwanted bow triggers in your swells. But the Roland is always going to start with 1 or 2 of those bow hits unless you hit it harder, and then that means you can't crescendo smoothly. And it's always going to be like that, which is a bit annoying. I would say the EFNOTE crashes generally have a nicer feeling because they're a bit thinner, and of course they're also bigger than the particular crashes that come with this Roland kit. And because they're 360 degrees, that means the trigger is active on all parts of the cymbal, whereas for the Roland, the triggers are only in the front of the cymbal. However, the downside of having a cymbal that is able to rotate when it's plugged in is that your cables can come loose if your cymbal is spinning around. So I think this might not have been as good a design decision as it seems. Like, yes, you could stand up and hit the back edges of your cymbals if you want to, but I don't think it's worth the possibility of your cymbals spinning around and then your cables getting unplugged. And I think that can be an issue if you don't screw them down tight enough. So I would still tighten the wing nuts on my EFNOTE cymbals so they don't rotate too much. One interesting observation that I didn't realize until filming this video is that both the EFNOTE crash and ride can do a hit choke, which is where you slam the stick into the cymbal and then it stops the sound. But only the smaller Roland crash can do that. The bigger one and the ride can't. It's weird. But of course, the Roland ride also has the touch to mute functionality. Everything else, you have to pinch the edge to stop the sound of the cymbal. The EFNOTE splash pad doesn't have anything that I can directly compare it to, but it's basically a one-zone trigger. It's not super sensitive, so I would just use that for an accent, crash, or splash sound. The rides function relatively similar to the crashes. For this one, the Roland ride definitely is more sensitive, but it is also very heavy, physically heavy. So it feels like hitting a very thick rock ride. And the EFNOTE ride, on the other hand, is a thinner ride, which feels nicer when you lay into it. Like if you're doing a lot of washy ride cymbal sounds, you're crashing the edge of the ride cymbal, the F-Note ride just feels physically a lot nicer to play than the Roland ride, which is a lot stiffer. But of course, this doesn't affect the sound that is produced. The Roland cymbals in general sound a little bit more natural when you're moving from the bow to the edge. The blend of these two sounds in the transition zone is a little bit nicer. The F-Note feels like you're really just shifting abruptly into that edge sound. But that said, the F-Note cymbals still do sound a little bit more natural than the Roland cymbals. Both of these hi-hats have really good pressure sensitivity. You can really hear the difference when you step harder on the pedal versus putting your foot lightly on the pedal, even for a closed hi-hat sound. But I feel like the Roland hi-hat generally did what I wanted it to do more than the F-Note hi-hat, which sometimes just didn't respond how I wanted. And the most obvious way that presented itself was when I tried to do a foot splash. And in the recording, I'm actually trying really hard to trigger it properly, but the foot splash sound always comes with a closed hi-hat sound, even when it does trigger properly. And it just took a lot of effort to get the sound to come out even remotely correctly, and sometimes it would still choke up. Whereas for the Roland hi-hat, the foot splash, I could just play it like I normally would. And this in particular would be quite frustrating if you're trying to learn how to do this and you think the problem is you, but no, the problem is the drums. As I mentioned earlier, I really like the sound of the F-Note hi-hat, and the Roland hi-hat has this thin, tinny sound that to me sounds worse than the rest of the cymbals, but in terms of functionality, the Roland hats still win. All right, now let's talk about the modules. The F-Note module is a lot smaller, and it is an older module than the V51, which just came out last year. The Roland module is clearly literally bigger, and it has a lot more functions in it. In terms of the screens, you can see that the F-Note screen is black and white, while the Roland has a full color LCD screen. That doesn't necessarily mean it's worse though. The F-Note screen is actually a touch screen, and it's not like phone screens where you need to use your fingers. You can actually poke it with a drumstick and it will detect that press. And that was something that I found pretty useful because I could kind of poke the module with my sticks halfway while playing, and I could just navigate to whatever I needed to adjust. I'm not going to go into great detail about what's in these modules, but suffice to say, the Roland module is a lot more in-depth. You can adjust far more parameters for every single thing, while the F-Note gives you limited adjustments, and for example, you can't layer different sounds together, you can't unlink the rims, you can basically just do basic EQ and leveling, and the effects are a little bit more limited than what you find in the Roland module, where you can adjust a ton of things. I don't think anyone would argue that Roland has the better module compared to the F-Note 5, but the question will be, which is the right module for you? It really depends on what your particular needs are. If you're someone who isn't really into adjusting a lot of settings and you are mostly a set and forget it kind of person, you don't want to do a lot of tweaks, then having limited functions can be a good thing. If you're not so exposed to sound and production ideas, the Roland module can be very overwhelming, especially in the advanced menus. Whereas if you're just getting started in things like EQ and sound adjustment, the EFNOTE module is a lot more beginner friendly because there's only a few parameters that you can adjust, and it's a lot easier to learn and figure out when you're just starting out. When it comes to recording capabilities, both of these modules can record multi-channel drums over USB, so you can connect them directly to your PC and record. The EFNOTE is going to use this micro USB connection, while the Roland module will use the more standard USB-C connection because it is a newer module. When you connect the Roland V51 module to your PC, you have up to 32 channels, which means you get stereo of every single sound on the drum kit. That means you'll have one channel, or rather one stereo channel for your left crash, your right crash, each tom, snare, kick, and so on. For the EFNOTE, on the other hand, you only have 8 tracks total. That means if you add an extra crash and tom, you're going to reduce the number of elements that you can separate out in your kit. So if I have 8 channels with my current kit setup, the way I had it was kick, snare, tom 1 and tom 2, and then my hi-hat and ride were separate, and my crash and splash were a stereo output together. So then I had a bit more fine control over the hats and ride, but the crash and the little splash were a stereo output mixed down because I only have 8 channels total versus the Roland's 32, where you can plug in your 4 aux channels and still have 16 stereo outputs total. For your own monitoring purposes, the EFNOTE only has that 3.5 mm output, whereas the Roland has your 1/4 inch or 3.5 mm, so that you have a bit more versatility in the type of headphones you're using, and you don't have to use an extra converter if your headphones use a 1/4 inch input jack. In terms of analog outputs, both of these have your main left and right stereo out, which are both 1/4 inch outputs. The EFNOTE has an additional stereo 3.5 mm output, which is actually the headphones jack, but you can split that into channels 3 and 4. So basically you have 4 total analog outputs, whereas Roland also has 2 direct outputs, which are also 1/4 inch, which brings you to a total of 4 1/4 inch direct outputs. And then on top of that, you also have the stereo phones out, which has a 1/4 inch out as well as a 3.5 mm. So I suppose technically we have 6 analog outputs for the Roland module. Other notable things that are module related that Roland has that the EFNOTE did not, that I felt particularly useful, were the inclusion of tap tempo as well as the voice count click. Tap tempo is basically the function where you can tap a certain button and it's going to estimate the speed and assign that to your metronome. And that is something that I really missed when I had the EFNOTE. It works really well for me when I'm teaching lessons using this kit. In fact, I have my tap tempo set up to the tom 1 rim. So while I'm working on a practice pad exercise with my student, I can reach over and hit the rim in the speed of whatever we're playing, and then I can turn on the click and it's going to be approximately at the speed that we're working on. The other useful thing is the voice count metronome, and that's the metronome function that will count out loud for you. This one is useful not only for teaching, but for my own practice, because sometimes you're just trying to work out a complicated fill and you want to outsource your counting to the metronome. But if you just use a normal click sound, it's not telling you exactly which count you're on. And the voice count can be useful in situations like that. One other thing I realized I forgot to mention earlier that sets apart the EFNOTE from the Roland is that they have this proprietary connector for the hi-hat. And this probably won't be an issue for most people, but in the case that you do spoil this, it's going to be a lot harder to replace than, for example, the Roland kit, which uses USB connections for the digital pads and 1/4 inch connections for the regular pads. And if anything happens to the cable, it'll be a lot easier to replace a generic USB or 1/4 inch instrument cable rather than this circular hi-hat connection that they have going. It's nice that their hats are only connected by a single cable, unlike the older models of Roland hats that needed 2 cables. But the digital hi-hat is also connected by a single USB. That's just a little bit easier to replace should anything happen to it. All right, now let's just do a quick summary of all the categories I've compared these 2 drum sets in and a short version of my thoughts on each. So if you skip the rest of the video, you'll at least get a rough idea of what I've been talking about so far. The first category will be trigger accuracy, and I'm going to give the win to Roland because basically it does what I want it to do. I didn't have to adjust my playing, and I never felt that I was fighting the drums to make the sounds come out the way I wanted them. Next category, the sounds. This one's going to be a tie. I will give the win to Roland for shells. I really like the snare and tom sounds. But for EFNOTE, I'm going to give it the win for more natural sounding cymbals, and especially hi-hat. In terms of the pads though, for the crashes, I'm also going to give it a tie because they both have pros and cons. For the EFNOTE crashes, if the triggers are working properly, you can have quiet edge sounds for your swell, but the Roland swell starts from the bow sound, which is irritating when you hit it quietly at the edge and you get the attack of a tip sound. However, I think the Roland swells still felt a little bit more smooth and better blended than the EFNOTE swells, and the EFNOTE triggers can kind of go a bit wonky after a while, but I suppose this applies to both of them. The other plus point in favor of EFNOTE is the crash does come with a bell trigger. So if it's important for you to have a 3-zone crash where you have a bell, bow, and edge trigger, then the EFNOTE might take the win in this category. When it comes to the pads for the hats, snare, toms, and kick though, I am giving the win to Roland because those all felt a lot better to me, more versatile, and the 14-inch snare really made a huge difference to me in getting a better feel out of the kit. In terms of ease of use of the module specifically, I will give the win to EFNOTE. And actually, now that I think of it, in terms of setting up the drums, it's also kind of easier to set up the EFNOTE because it's pretty much an actual drum set. But I was thinking more of the module when I put this category in, and the EFNOTE module is a lot more beginner-friendly than the Roland module, which can be a bit intimidating. In terms of editing features though, definitely the win goes to Roland because there is so much that you can do within the module. And in terms of recording, I will also give that win to Roland because you have multi-channel recording for every single element in the kit, and it's a lot easier to do any post-processing that you might need to do. In terms of aesthetics though, I'm giving that to the EFNOTE because it's a really good looking drum set, and if I didn't have to have my drums in a studio for teaching and I just had them in my living room, I might be tempted to go with the EFNOTE just because it would look so much better in that open space. I always felt that the EFNOTE was a little bit wasted in this little hidden corner of my studio because no one ever gets to see it from the front. Finally, in terms of durability, I'll give the win to Roland. I probably haven't used the TD516 long enough to be able to tell if anything will really go wrong with it, but based on my previous experiences with Roland drums, the previous drum set I was using before I switched to EFNOTE was 10 years old and it was still functioning pretty well. Based on that and what I've seen from other people's drum sets, I'm going to say that there's probably a higher chance of your Roland kit outlasting EFNOTE in terms of durability. Those are all my observations regarding these two drum sets, but why I personally shifted to the Roland kit is because of my particular needs. And I'm a drum teacher teaching on this electronic drum set while my students play on my acoustic kit. And it was confusing for some beginner students that I only had one rack tom or I only had one crash and one ride when they had two crashes on their drum sets and they had two rack toms. If I was the only one playing the drums for my own practice, it wouldn't really matter because I know how to simplify songs and orchestrate them differently if I need to go from a 4-piece to a 5-piece kit. But for someone who's starting out, it can be confusing. When I played the EFNOTE, I couldn't add on an extra tom or an extra cymbal because of space constraints, but the TD516 being on a rack allows me to have those extra components. So it makes a lot of sense for my purposes in terms of teaching. The fact that it's a rack-based and pad kit also helps a lot for a very silly reason, and that is it allows my students to have a better view of my leg when I'm playing the bass drum. And this is such a weird thing, but for the 2 years that I played the EFNOTE, every time I have to demonstrate bass drum technique, I literally have to shift the floor tom away so that my student can see what my foot is doing on the pedal. And it's a very small thing, but it makes a difference. Really, I feel that the difference between the EFNOTE drums and Roland drums is that EFNOTE tries to emulate acoustic drums, whereas Roland drums are unapologetically electronic drum sets. And in my use case, I actually have acoustic drums. I don't need electronic drums that are trying to be acoustic drums. I just need electronic drums that preferably emulate my acoustic setup so that I can practice on it at night without disturbing anybody, and then use that muscle memory and transfer it to my acoustic drums later. Because I already have acoustic drums, I don't have a problem with my electronic drum set sounding like an electronic drum set. In fact, I would rather it sound like an electronic drum set so that I have other sounds that I can access, and it inspires you in different ways to hear different sounds. The EFNOTE also just felt like a bop kit because it is, and that's a drum set with smaller shell sizes. In fact, it's a mini bop kit. It's even smaller than a usual bop kit. And that made me feel like I had to play light, funky kind of grooves when I was jamming on the EFNOTE 5. Even if I put in metal-sounding triggered sounds as the drum kit, it still didn't feel right. And I think that's because the drum is made of actual shells and there's a particular feel when you play them. There's a particular tone that you hear acoustically, even though it's softer and quieter because the batter and the reso are both mesh. And it is so funny that I felt this way because I previously used to play a smaller Roland pad bass kit with like 8 or 10-inch pads. And I never felt limited in that way because the pads just give that more generic feel. It's like playing on a practice pad. It could be anything. But when you're playing in an actual shell kit, it somehow affects how you feel about the music and what you're playing. I do enjoy playing funky, groovy stuff, but a lot of the music that I play is also heavier rock and metal. The EFNOTE wasn't as versatile in that regard, and the Roland TD516 does make it a lot more enjoyable to practice playing heavier genres. All that is regarding my own situation and personal preferences. Yours will very likely be different. I highly recommend heading down to your local music shop to try out both of these kits in person so that you can make a more informed decision based on the feel of the drums as well as the sounds they make. If you're leaning towards getting an EFNOTE kit and you're into playing rock or metal and heavier genres of music, I would highly suggest looking into bigger shell sizes. For a lot of people, the sound is going to be something that pushes you towards one or the other of these two systems. But if you're kind of neutral on the sounds, then I'd say if you prefer a fuss-free, simple system, you value aesthetics, and you're not a really heavy hitter, then maybe the EFNOTE is a better drum set for you. And on the other hand, if you prefer more flexibility and versatility in the kinds of sounds you're creating with your electronic drums, you like editing and getting your hands dirty in the module, and you possibly need more of a space-saving setup, then the 516 might be a better choice. That brings us to the end of this video. I hope that was interesting and useful to you. And if you have any other questions about either of these two drum sets, just let me know in the comments and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!